Well, it's Monday night, it's 5 minutes past 9, which is time to open the LBC Book Club. That's what we always do this time on a Monday. And delighted to say, round the table with me to discuss their respective books, I have Christian Wolmar. He's a regular voice here on London's Biggest Conversation, and he's written a book called Engines of War, How Wars Were Won and Lost on the Railways. And it's, Christian, I don't know how many books you've written about trains now, but it must be getting into double figures. I mean, nearly into double figures then. But it's an absolutely fascinating book. It's published by, he says quickly looking, who's
Atlantic Books.
Atlantic Books, that's the one, £20 in hardback.
Well, nobody pays £20 these days, do they?
No, they don't, sadly. And also joining me is Bobby Friedman. He's written a biography of the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow. I'm not quite sure what the main title is Bercow, but is the subtitle Mr. Speaker or Rowdy Living in the Tory Party, or both?
Well, you can take your pick, whichever you prefer, but Rowdy Living in the Tory Party.
And it's got a very... The cartoon on the cover has got John Bercow's wife Sally sitting in the chair, in the Speaker's chair, with John Bercow on her knee. And that it reminds me of that Spitting Image sketch of David Owen with David Steele in his pocket, which you're probably too young to remember.
Well, I am a little bit too young to remember, but I think it's in a good kind of British tradition of political caricatures.
Well, let's start talking about your book, Bobby. What made you want to write a book about John Bercow?
Well, it sort of happened around June 2009, just after John was elected as Speaker. And I think what it is about him is that there's such an obvious media narrative with him that, and particularly around that time, about people in the Tory party being very angry about his election as Speaker. But I kind of had this hunch that there was more to it, and I wanted to investigate, in a way, this Marmite man that people either love or hate, and to try and find out a little bit more about what lies behind that, and also to delve a little bit deeper into John. And I think that he's sadly one of the few real political characters that still exist in Parliament. There are very few, and I think there's something that makes that quite a compelling story, and I was pleasantly surprised and enjoyed going through the research stage to find out more and more about him, and I think there is more to him than meets the eye.
Now, he didn't cooperate with the book. It wasn't authorised at all, or did he cooperate a little bit?
Well, his view was that he wasn't going to tell people to speak to me, but he wasn't going to tell people not to speak to me, which was a help. But I think all of the best biographies, I mean, we like to call them independent rather than unauthorised, but I suppose most people would call it unauthorised. But I think all good biographies should be unauthorised, really, because otherwise you're getting a version of events that has been checked by someone else, and it kind of takes all the value away from it. So I don't think the fact it's unauthorised means that it's hostile. It just means that it's actually fair, and it says, hopefully, the truth, and just says what I actually think, rather than having been censored in a way.
What made you pick on him in particular, though? Because, I mean, he's not... I mean, OK, yes, he is the Speaker of the House of Commons, but he's not a sort of one of these titanic political figures. I just wonder what the market is for a book about the Speaker of the House of Commons. He's not a Betty Boothroyd, who was sort of classed to the bosom of the nation, in a way. There isn't that must-buy feature about him, I don't think.
Well, I suppose we have to give him a bit of time. He's only been in the job less than 2 years. But the thing about him, and in a way what sets him apart from Betty Boothroyd and from Michael Martin, is that I think there is just something about him. And it's almost a little bit intangible, a bit hard to describe. But people have opinions about John. And I think that's what makes him so engaging, because when you go through the research stage and you're spending a very large chunk of your own life investigating, thinking about someone else, you don't want to be calling people up and everyone say, well, I met him and I don't really think very much about him, actually. And that's the thing about John. His is a great political story because he makes an impact wherever he goes, and I think he also actually says quite a lot about what's happened in the Conservative Party and how the Tory Party has reacted to New Labour, because his story is, in a sense, a story about Conservative modernisation and the difficulties that the party has had and the differences within the party as to how it modernises.
Isn't the interesting thing about him that his political journey is the wrong direction to most people, because actually he started out as a kind of on the crazy right of the Tory party, and now some of what he says is, or certainly before he became Speaker and was neutralised, was really quite left-wing, some of it, and he was definitely on the left of the Tory party. So, and most people, notionally kind of go to the right as they get older, don't they?
Before we look at his journey from right to sort of semi-left, just tell us a bit about his early political career, because I was actually at university with John Bercow. I was at the same time. He was at the University of Essex and I was at East Anglia in Norwich. And I did meet him a couple of times then. He was an absolutely spellbinding speaker, I mean, really brilliant orator. But he was on the hard right, I mean, the authoritarian right, the Monday Club right, the sort of hang 'em, flog 'em, send 'em home right, which is very different from what he is now.
Well, yeah, it's completely different. And I think he has, in a sense, apologised and said, well, my views have changed. And of course they have, because very early on he was, as you say, in the Monday Club, which is about as right-wing as you can get within the Tory party. He was...
It's not actually even within the Tory party any longer, thank God.
Well, exactly, and he was... and I think there are reasons for that. I mean, he was Secretary of the Immigration and Repatriation Committee, which wanted voluntary repatriation of immigrants. And remember, his grandfather was an immigrant to the UK. So that was very right-wing. He then moved and was head of the FCS, which was basically
the Federation of Conservative Students.
That's right, yes. And it's a kind of Leninist hard right Tory organisation, if that makes sense. So they would use the tactics of the extreme left with the views of the extreme right of the Tory party. And Bercow was a little bit more moderate than some of the other people in there, but
as was I. Let me make clear.
Oh, you were in there as well, were you?
I was. I was at that famous conference when they kicked in all the doors.
At Loughborough.
At Loughborough, I was there.
Yes, Tory louts go on the rise. Indeed. Or something. That was the headline,
I was cowering under my bed.
I'm afraid I was a student rebelling against Patrick Wall. Do you remember him?
I do remember him.
Some of your listeners might remember him, who was in the Monday Club, and he came to Warwick University where I was, and I'm afraid I was one of the protesters, Ian.
Well, that's fine. It's a free country.
But I think there's something about student politics then that was just infinitely more interesting. And for me, having been involved in student politics in my own way, when it was much more dull. It's the sort of thing the FCS would do, as you might know, Ian, the sort of getting in minibuses through the night and going all across Yorkshire and posting signs across town saying, "Stop Scargill's thugs, national ballot now," that kind of guerrilla warfare. So I think was much more interesting. I think you can see that still, even though his views have changed, coming through in John's tactics, that he's quite resourceful in that way, and there was a lot of fun to be had, but a lot of pretty strong views, and I think we probably would agree that, and John and I would agree that his views now have certainly changed quite a lot since then.
Now, what happened to him after university?
So after university, in a way, it's a relatively well-worn path. He got involved in... He was a banker for a very short period of time and didn't enjoy it very much, and he then went into political lobbying, where he did rather well and could have carried on and done even better, but he got involved with running for various seats, first up in Scotland. He then, even at quite a young age, still at 26, he went for his second seat in Bristol, and he had... to give you an idea of how sort of relatively young he was, when he turned up there, the agent got very worried because she noticed that he had a hole in his shoe, and she thought, oh God, that means he doesn't drive. I'm going to have to drive him round everywhere. And so John, he got on very well with him and valiantly agreed to learn to drive, and he passed his test eventually. And then kind of exultantly came down to Bristol, and they had a bit of a get-together at the constituency chairman's house, and they were waiting for him there. The first time he'd managed to drive down. He drives down, and he pulls up outside the house and smashes into the car directly outside. And whose car was it? The constituency chairman's car, of course. And that was him afterwards. And then there's a route after that, a very interesting one. He was Jonathan Aitken's special advisor at the time when Aitken then went down. And he moved from there and then eventually was selected for Buckingham and made it into Parliament.
And, of course, there's an interesting story about that, isn't there, involving helicopters?
Well, exactly. And I think, again, it shows how resourceful he is. That John had been going for safe seats, and he was given 2 selections on one night. And so he thought, what can I do about it? And most people would say, well, God, they're 2.5 hours away and it's pretty much the same time, I'll have to pick one. No, for John, what he did was he went and hired a helicopter, paid £1,000 for it, he said the best £1,000 he'd ever spent. And it was like a kind of bad spy novel that he sort of shot through the night in the darkness, and there were cars with their indicators on, waiting for him to land, and he jumps out of the car. He makes it there just in time, and Howard Flight, who later became an MP, had spoken just before. He thought he was good. He thought he had a pretty good chance of winning, and then John rushes in the room and says, "Just because I'm a small man, it doesn't mean I don't have a big ambition." And that was it. And Buckingham was his.
You see, nowadays, I think if someone did that, people would just think smug git, wouldn't they? Or sort of show off. And I think it would probably go down very badly with the selection committee, but those were different days.
Well, they were, and I think it showed that he wanted it. It showed resourcefulness, and it's the same kind of desire that he has. And I think this is what makes him such a great character. I mean, by this time he was working for Virginia Bottomley, and her husband Peter, due to boundary changes, was going for another seat. And Bercow applied against his boss's husband for the same seats. And other people might have said, "Well, I'll just hold back from this one," but Bercow was having none of it.
Shows a degree of ruthlessness.
But in a way didn't want to let anything get in the way. And I'm not sure that you could criticise that in a way. I think he wanted to be an MP, and I think he thought he would be good for the job, and why not go for it? And these opportunities don't come along that often.
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale. Bobby Friedman is with me. He's the voice you just heard. He's written a book called Bercow. It's a biography of John Bercow. And we'll also be hearing, after the travel, from Christian Wolmar, whose book, Engines of War, How Wars Were Won and Lost on the Railways. And I'm sure Christian will be listening to the travel very avidly, because that's what he kind of does for a living. It's 9:16. And here's Alan Joyce.
Thanks, Ian. Well, some big problems on the trains this evening after that.
Christian Wolmar and Bobby Friedman are with me this evening talking about their books on, one's called The Engines of War, How Wars Were Won and Lost on the Railways, and the other is a biography of John Bercow. A couple of texts about Bobby's book on John Bercow. Anne-Marie in W1, Bercow commands no respect from anyone. But by way of contrast, Peter in Birmingham says John is the best speaker since World War II. He is somebody that, as you say, divides the country a bit. If you'd like to ask Bobby Friedman any questions about his book, or indeed Christian Wolmar, the number to call is 0845 6060 973. You can text us on 84850. Email Ian, IAIN, at lbc.co.uk, or you can, of course, tweet us at lbc973. Right, Christian, let's move on to talk about your book. Now, I have to say, I'm going to be completely honest here. When I saw the title, I did think, what a tedious subject.
Oh dear.
But there is a but. But then I started looking at the book, and it's absolutely fascinating. And it just made me think, well, I had never thought about about the role of trains and engines in war. But I mean, you bring it so much to life, discussing all the different conflicts. What was it that made you sort of approach this subject in the first place?
Well, it was my previous book, which was called Blood, Iron and Gold, which was actually about the world's railways. And I suddenly realised that there was a much bigger story about how railways affected war. And there's a kind of conventional view of railways and warfare, which is that, lots of people get in trains and they go out to the war and they're waved off by their sweethearts. And every film about war almost has that. And there it stops. But actually what is really important is that railways created modern warfare. They actually increased the scale that you could have wars at. And there's a very good example of that, which is that the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Waterloo, took place in a single day, right? You think of it as this kind of big conflict and whatever. It was over in a few hours. And the reason for that is that until you got railways, wars tended to be just a battle of a day or two, because the armies would run out of food, and most important, the horses would run out of food, right? So the forage would run out. You just couldn't bring the food in, so, one side or other had to run away, and the other side won. So by the time you get to the American Civil War, which is the 105th anniversary, actually today, of the start of the American Civil War, you get a completely different type of warfare. And the American Civil War was one of the bloodiest, nastiest conflicts in history, because the railways enabled both sides to keep on fighting with each other. And the railways keep on bringing people into the war, taking them away in hospital trains, in fact, even later on, and bringing ammunitions, and so that they actually prolong wars in a dreadful way. And so we get 100 years between about 1850 and 1950 where railways are absolutely dominant in warfare. And so that's why it's more interesting. And as you say, you know, at first I thought, no, there isn't a book here. And then I realised there's a very interesting book. And I'm slightly rewriting some military history here, because a lot of military historians ignore that.
I actually think you are, because, I mean, if you'd said to me, what about the role of trains in wars, I would have immediately thought of the concentration camps and all of the trains taking Jews to concentration camps. And I would have probably not gone beyond that, because I wouldn't have had the imagination to. But how on earth do you do the research for a book like this?
Well, I spent quite a bit of time in the Imperial War Museum, where there was sort of unique stuff. But I actually found out the Imperial War Museum was only created as a result of the Great War, and so it doesn't actually stretch back further. So I scraped around, to be honest, for books on each of the wars. I cover the Crimean, I cover the Franco-Prussian, I cover the American Civil War, the Boer War, and each of those I read a couple of books on the war itself, and then tried to dig up as much as possible about the railways and their impact in the war. Churchill is one of my great heroes in this, because Churchill realised the impact of railways straight away. He's involved in the Sudan War, which was in 1898, where we reconquered Sudan. He was involved in the Boer War. He was obviously involved in the First World War and the Second World War. Churchill appears the whole time, and was always understood that railways were absolutely vital for warfare.
So, of all the wars that you cover in the book, which one of them would you say that railways played the biggest role in?
Well, it's slightly split answer here. The Russo-Japanese War was created entirely by the railway. The building of the Trans-Siberian Railway caused the Russo-Japanese War, because the Japanese thought, the Russians are stretching their way into Asia, we don't want this, we're going to declare war on them. But the apogee of railways and warfare, of course, is the First World War. And now there, it's very interesting, because it's not only the mainline big grown-up railways that we know about, which are 4 foot 8.5 gauge. I know it's boring and technical, but that's what most railways are. But there were also these little railways. So the main railways would deliver the troops and the guns and everything to 7 miles from the front. But after 7 miles, any nearer than 7 miles, they were within range of the shells. So for the last 7 miles, they built these tiny little 60-centimetre railways, which looked like toy town railways, really, with little petrol engines, some of them with steam engines. And they brought all the ammunition, all the troops, right to the front, and kept on bringing them to the front. So you got this terrible stalemate for 3.5 years in the First World War that was entirely caused by the state of transportation at the time. That you had the impact to supply the front with railways. You couldn't bomb them from the air because the aviation wasn't sophisticated enough. You didn't have good roads, so motorised transport was actually pretty lousy, get stuck in the mud. So the railways delivered all this stuff, and it got stuck for 3.5 years until finally, initially the Germans and then the Allies broke through.
Well, one of the interesting things, Christian, from the depths of my schoolboy history was the A.J.P. Taylor's theory about timetables in the First World War being what decided.
Did they really study him when you were at school as well?
Well,
I thought they'd phased him out by then.
No, still going, only just there. I couldn't tell you much more than that. I don't remember much else.
Yes, that's right. He had this theory, which he espoused in quite a lot of different books, that really the Kaiser wanted peace, but once he pushed the button for all these railways to start taking people to the front, you couldn't stop it, because the railway timetable wouldn't allow it. And actually it's bunk, I'm afraid. I mean, A.G.P. Taylor is a great historian, and I'm sure a lot of what he wrote is right, but in this case it's absolute rubbish. What really happened was that they'd organised this plan called the Schlieffen Plan, which was to get to Paris. You're supposed to get to Paris in 39 days, right? Great idea. You go through Belgium, which was neutral. The idea was Belgium would just allow them to walk through and wouldn't kind of get in their way, and they'd take this route round the north of France to Paris, conquer Paris, and then and conquer France, and then they'd go off to Russia and conquer Russia. That was the idea. And of course it went very badly wrong because the Belgians fought against them and the British arrived and so on. But A.J.P. Taylor's idea was that, that the Kaiser pushed the button and then thought, oh no, I really want to stop this. Absolutely not true. The Kaiser hesitated only because at one point he said, maybe we ought to attack Russia first and not attack Germany, not attack France. We don't want to attack both at the same time. But the idea that it was the rigidity of the timetables that caused the war is absolutely not true, I'm afraid.
Now, you say that, and this is obviously very quick, but you say that they were vital up until the Korean War. Why only up until then?
Well, because, that's quite late, in fact, because by the time of the Vietnam War, you get the railways being involved a little bit, but actually they then get blown up. And the difficulty until the Korean War was blowing up railways from the air was actually quite difficult. There wasn't the precision-guided missiles, so they tried to blow up lots of railways in the Korean War and failed to do so. This is the UN side. And by the time you get the Vietnam War and wars subsequent to that, you no longer have the sort of mass warfare anymore because you have these missiles. You don't have hundreds of troops going in the field. You get a different type of warfare.
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club. If you'd like to ask either of my authors a question, the number to call is 0845 6060 973.
LBC 97.
And I'm here with you until 10 o'clock here with the LBC Book Club. And after 10, it's Duncan Barks who's sitting in for Clive Bull this week. Duncan.
Good evening, Ian. How are you?
Hi, what's on your programme tonight?
Well, lots of stuff going on. I've been listening to LBC throughout most of today. Heard Nick talk about this morning, also James on Drive Time as well. And whenever we talk about the burqa or the face veil, and obviously the ban kicked in France earlier today, and we've seen a mild protest outside the French Embassy in London earlier this evening, there's a lot of ranting that goes on. A lot of people sort of like bang the drum and say, this is outrageous, I don't think people should be wearing the burqa. And then you get people with the opposite viewpoint and stuff. What I want to try and strip down and almost deconstruct after 10 tonight is why. Why is it so divisive? I just want a simple sentence. I want to understand why so many people are scared of the burqa in this country, because previously when I've worked on various radio shows, I've had people say, I don't like it, it scares me, they look like Daleks. And ultimately, you strip it down, you think it's a piece of clothing, what's the matter with you? So we're going to look at that after 10. Also, look at this idea of maybe adopting a different faith for a month. A man's come up with this idea. You can be a Sikh for a week. I know, it's a great marketing slogan, isn't it? And also a Muslim for a month as well. And maybe we can join these two things together, because maybe this
Christian for a century.
Absolutely. This fear of the burqa is down possibly to maybe ignorance. So we'll look at that in more detail after 10 tonight. Also, earlier today in London, National Stalking Awareness Week kicked off, the first awareness week of its kind in the United Kingdom. And the British Crime Survey suggested up to 5 million people a year suffer from stalking or harassment. Now, when you consider that the population of London is around, 8 million? That's the adult population. That is a startling statistic. So we'll look at that in more detail.
Well,
Plus,
with all your fans, you must have been stalked at some point.
Well, what is stalking? What is the definition of stalking?
Indeed.
If someone's on Facebook and they keep asking you to be your friend and you keep just going, go away, I don't like you, go away. After 4 or 5 attempts, can you say, I have a stalker? So we'll look at that in more detail. Plus, we're looking at careers advice as well, because it appears that young ladies are turning to gender stereotypical careers such as hairdressing and beauty therapy, because that's what their careers advisors are telling them to do in schools.
Ooh, you better be careful with that one.
What were you advised to do? When you went to your careers advisor, what did you say?
I told them what I was going to do.
And you went ahead and did it?
No. Duncan, thank you very much. We'll hear more from you at 10 o'clock. Now, let me just reintroduce my guests around the table for the LBC Book Club. Bobby Friedman has written a biography of the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow. It's published by Gibson Square Books, $17.99 in hardback. Christian Wolmar has written Engines of War, How Wars Were Won and Lost on the Railways. It's published by Atlantic Books in hardback at £20. And it's page for page, Christian. I have to say, sort of your book's probably the better value, because it's 300 pages compared to a mere 230.
Jolly good.
Right, now let's come back to you, Bobby. Oh, and by the way, if you want to ask either our authors a question, 0845 6060 973 is, of course, the number to call. How did this journey start from right to, I won't say left, because I don't consider John Bercow to be a left-winger, but he's probably on the left of the Conservative Party now.
Oh, for sure. I mean, he's far closer now to Ken Clarke than John Redwood in terms of his politics, whereas obviously 15 years ago that would have been completely the other way round. But I think it's been a gradual process, and sometimes it is overplayed. I think that he had very strong views when he was younger, and I think it's natural that they mellowed as he got older. But
when he was first elected, he was still fairly hard, right? I remember speeches that he would give on the back benches alongside Eric Forth, sort of very, very trenchant right-wing speeches.
You're right, yes. Although I think he was less right-wing than he was back in his student days, although he was very right-wing then, so it was comparative. But I think it was also part of the general look within the Conservative Party at what was going wrong. And I think you can draw the comparison with Michael Portillo, actually. And I think John looked at the fact that the Conservatives had lost a couple of elections very badly and thought, well, we do need to change. And I think as well, he was maturing. He then got a family and mellowed, and I think that all fed into the process. But I think there's also something about John, which is that, as one MP said to me, he's always at the North Pole or the South Pole. So that when he believes in something, he then becomes a real drum banger for it. And so you kind of sometimes get the impression that that the change has been more dramatic than perhaps it might have been, because he speaks up very vocally for something. But I think it is a gradual process, but I think it also fits in with that broader trend, really, within the Conservative Party.
And what role did his wife Sally play in this transformation?
Well, I think, like any spouse, Sally has had a part to play. I mean, she will have influenced his views. My girlfriend influences my views, I influence hers, and that's how people are with people close to them.
So you like to think.
Well, she influences me. I'm not sure if the other way around, but no, I think that it isn't. Sally plays a part, but it isn't because of her alone, and certainly it started well before John and Sally were married, and a lot of the key moments where he started to move, for example, over the gay age of consent, which is something that I think we'd agree with, and I think he was right over that. That was before he and Sally were married. So I think the trend was already well in place before they did marry.
Well, you'll never guess who's rung into the programme, Bobby.
I think I can.
But joining us on the phone now is Sally Bercow, presumably live from the House of Commons. Sally, good evening.
Hello there, Ian. Hi.
Hi.
I'm your stalker, you know. I was listening to your radio programme, and then Bobby Friedman popped up, so I had to ring, because I've got a question for him.
Go on, what would you like to say to Bobby? Because it must be a bit weird having someone write a book about, effectively, you and your husband.
Oh, it's completely bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. I must confess that I haven't read the book, but there was a couple of extracts in the Mail on Sunday, and one of them really, really has sort of been bugging me ever since, really, because I just can't believe it. And I've got no time for the Conservative Party, and I don't put much past them in terms of playing dirty tricks. But it said in the Mail on Sunday that they were trying to find a terminally ill candidate during the general election to stand against my husband, so that if that candidate died, the election in Buckingham would have to be rerun. And I just thought, that can't be true. Surely they wouldn't stoop that low.
Well, Sally, I think it's one of those. It wasn't a plan that was near to fruition. I think it was something that was talked about, and
so they didn't go and stand outside sort of terminally ill hospital wards or anything like that.
Well, who came up with this plan then?
That's something I can't say. But
all right. Well, what kind of person?
As someone or people from the right who are not fans of John, and I think it was just one of the things that was talked about, and I think, you know, and Sally, you haven't read the book. I mean, that it is a small paragraph in the book, and I don't think it should be overstated. I don't think that, as you say, they were standing outside cancer wards looking for someone to do this. But I think it does give some kind of
very
idea.
Revealing about the Conservative Party, though.
Well, I think it's more revealing in general about the people opposing John. And I think, as I say in the book, and as some MPs told me, the tribal feeling was in a way out of all proportion. That people, obviously in politics, people like people and people dislike people. But I think the strength of feeling was unduly strong, actually. And I think it's seen, and it's not just in that, it's in other things that were going on. There was a vote-swapping plan with UKIP that was going on, that people, they even commissioned an agency to look into how it would work, where UKIP voters would swap votes with Conservative voters. It didn't go anywhere again. But I think it does give you an idea that there was opposition.
Now, Bobby, seeing as you didn't get to interview Sally for the book, I think as she's on the phone now,
Ian.
You can ask one question of her.
But I might not answer.
Knowing you will, though.
What do I mean? There are so many questions that I want to ask. I mean, I suppose what I want to know, Sally, because obviously you come under the spotlight a lot over the past year or two. I mean, do you kind of enjoy it, or do you wish we'd all go away? Although hopefully I put myself in a slightly different category to some of the coverage. I think
you haven't been plaguing us at all, Bobby. To be fair. To be honest, most of the time I quite enjoy it. I think it's all a bit of fun, and it's just, I'm my own worst enemy. I talk too much, and I'm too gobby, basically, so I put my foot in it far too many times. But on the whole, I love it. It's great fun, and what the best thing is seeing somebody that you love doing the job that they adore and have wanted for years, and, that's just wonderful.
How much of a role do you think you have played in your husband's journey from hard right to not quite so hard right?
Very little.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He just sort of matured and, there's very little to do with me, Ian. I wish it was. I'm not that influential.
I'm not sure I believe you.
Yeah, well.
Well, Sally, thank you very much for joining us on the programme tonight. It's always a pleasure. Cheers.
Thanks, Sally.
Isn't it nice to know that we have the wife of the Speaker of the House of Commons listening to the programme?
Yeah, very good.
Well, that was a little surprise for you. It was a surprise to me as well, because she did actually ring in. It wasn't us ringing her. Now, how did he fall out of favour with the Conservative Party? Because he was in the shadow cabinet under Ian Duncan Smith. He resigned over the age of consent. He was bitter enemies with Michael Howard for reasons which I can't quite remember, but you can probably shed some light on. And then never really got back onto the front bench. Maybe it was his own choice. And really, I suppose the speakership was the only thing left for him.
Well, I think you're right there, that there were 3 or 4 incidents where John alienated himself a little bit from the front bench. Sometimes, one would say rightly, and sometimes perhaps he could have held back a bit. And it was for different reasons. I think that he was modernising too quickly, actually, for the party. I think there's no surprise that, say, Michael Portillo is also outside of the Conservative mainstream party now, outside of Parliament at least, and the two of them were the arch modernisers. So, for example, with Ian Duncan Smith, John resigned because there was a 3-line whip making Tory MPs vote against gay adoption. I think it would be utterly inconceivable now that David Cameron would ever do something remotely like that. But when it came to Michael Howard, and actually it was rather ironic in a way, because, and perhaps John didn't know this, Michael Howard had actually stood up to Ian Duncan Smith a number of times and saved John's job when he was Shadow Chief Secretary and Michael Howard was Shadow Chancellor. And he thought he was rather talented. And then when Michael became leader, then what happened was John wrote a letter praising Tony Blair's statesmanship over the Iraq War, and that was really the final straw. But he could again have got back into frontline politics, but when it came to David Cameron's election, John made what I think was quite an outspoken attacking Cameron for his father being a member of White's and hunting and Eton, and I think Cameron took that very personally, and Ken Clarke, who Bercow supported, didn't really agree with his either, and I don't think it was a necessary attack. And it's unfortunate, really, because otherwise I think Bercow could have fitted in quite well in a David Cameron cabinet, because he was a moderniser. And so I think, and John recognises this, that he was never comfortable with being on the front bench and having collective responsibility. He hates the whips, for example. And if you don't like the whips, then it's hard to stay in line.
And just, I'm afraid, in 30 seconds, if you can, what kind of speaker do you think he's going to be? And is he going to last the course? Because there are a lot of people in the Conservative Party out to get him, aren't there?
There are people out to get him. Now, without wanting to make too solid a prediction, I think he will last the course, but he is perhaps a little more vulnerable than your average speaker to some event. If it sparks up, then that could create the thing that could get rid of him. But I think he would stay through to the end. And I think most people recognise he's actually doing a pretty good job. He gets through the order paper well, and if he annoys the government, well, it's kind of good in a way that the Speaker of the House of Commons isn't letting the government get away with everything.
Well, that's the voice of Bobby Friedman. He's written a biography of John Bercow. It's called Bercow, Mr. Speaker, and it's available now in all good and indeed bad bookshops.
Well, not the Parliamentary Bookshop.
No, not the Parliamentary Bookshop. I've read in the Evening Standard tonight. They've banned it. They don't like anything controversial
Not
in the
good for free
Parliamentary
speech.
Bookshop. It has to be said. Now we'll be talking to Christian Wolmar just after the travel about his book, which is called Engines of War. The time now is 9:46. And here's Alan Joyce with the LBC Travel.
Thanks, Ian. Well, still big problems on the trains out of Euston tonight.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club. Bobby Friedman's with me, Christian Wolmar's with me, and next week on the Book Club I'm going to be talking to Humphrey Hunter, who's written a book intriguingly titled The Men Files. And also in the next few weeks we're going to be talking to Douglas Hurd, Fatima Bhutto, Paddy Ashdown and Peter Mandelson. So a very varied mixture there for you over the next few weeks here on the LBC Book Club. Now, Christian Wolmar, we have somebody who'd like to talk to you. He is called Graham. He's in Kingston. Graham, good evening.
Good evening, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to say to Christian?
I reenact Second World War, which probably is a peculiar thing to do, and I also do it on the German side, but we attend various places around the country that require us to turn up in uniform, one of which is Fort Nelson on the south coast, and there they have a section of the German 60-centimetre railway, which they used in the Second World War to arm the Bofors guns on the top.
Right, that's not the Romney, Dymchurch and What's-It Railway, is it? Where they actually had an armoured train on that to defend ourselves against the Germans.
Yes, I understand that as well, but this is just apparently they dug this section of railway up from the First World War and then stuck it in there when the Second World War looked like it was going to occur. So that's how it's there, and it's clearly marked when you go down to Fort Nelson, which is open to the public to see all year round.
Well, there's a nice Sunday trip for you,
I
Christian.
must go down there one day, yes. Take my partner.
Well, Graham, I'm fascinated by this idea of Second World War reenactment. We haven't got a lot of time, but how can you reenact things when there weren't any battles in this country?
That's because it gets very difficult. People have to write special scripts to make it look as though it's real. You obviously can't reenact the real side of war, but it gives people some idea of what the uniforms look like, what type of battles occurred. They normally run about 40 minutes when we do artificial battles. Needless to say, we only fire blanks and not real bullets.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, but there is an awful lot of training that needs to be done during what I call the cold weather time, which we all get up to make sure that we look properly when we do it.
OK, Graham, thank you very much indeed for calling the programme. We've got to move on because I want to ask Christian about the Second World War, actually, and the role that railways played. And as I said before, from my point of view, I suppose one of the main things was the trains that took the Jews to the concentration camps. But obviously they played a huge logistical role. What about the Russian front? Because aren't there different gauges in Eastern Europe? How did that affect the supply chain?
Yes, it did. I mean, I do mention the Jewish Holocaust thing, partly because I couldn't not mention it, because the railways did play an essential role. They couldn't have done it by road, and that's a kind of one of the most awful bits of railway history. On the gauge front, that's a very interesting point. Russia deliberately, in the 1840s, when they first got a railway, built it to a different gauge, which means that the size between the rails is different, which means you can't run trains through, because they were worried about being attacked from other European countries. And 100 years later, it came in very handy because the Germans invaded Russia in 1941, and they were greatly hampered by the fact that they had 3 different armies with a railway behind each one, and they were basically aiming at Stalingrad, Leningrad and Moscow, and they were hampered by the fact that they had to change the gauge of the railways as they progressed, because their locomotives couldn't operate on the Russian sections, or else they took over the Russian railways, but then they'd have to discharge all their goods at some point from the German railways, and that actually slowed down their advance and was a key point to why they never got to any of those destinations quickly enough to invade, to conquer Russia quickly enough, and they got stuck there thankfully, and enabled us to have a bit of breathing space in which time we built up resources to eventually win the war. So it made the whole difference, that.
So you could argue, as I don't know, as a military historian, but as any kind of historian, that actually it was the railways that made the difference between the West winning and not.
Well, absolutely, and they made it in a different way as well, in that Hitler didn't, although he did invest some things in the railways, he was really a bit of a petrol head. You know, he would have watched Top Gear, you know, rather than being a train spotter. And he actually devoted a lot of resources to their motorway network, famously the Autobahn network, and kind of trying to build that up, and didn't devote enough resources to the railways. I thought he made the trains run on time, or was that Mussolini? No, that was Mussolini, and it's not true. I'm afraid that's another myth that I debunk in one of my other books. Actually, it was a PR exercise, and it was one train.
Has anyone ever made the trains run on time?
Probably not, actually.
No.
But you know, there we are. That's another story. Except on the high-speed lines, you know. But that's another story.
And what about in this country during the Second World War? Because presumably the railways played an important part supplying supplies for the D-Day landings, for example.
Oh, absolutely. They were totally essential. They were essential in America too, oddly enough. In America, in the First World War, they actually nationalised the railways, which is something you don't expect the Americans to do. Yes, which Americans don't really like nationalising things, and so but they did it because they needed the railways to operate efficiently. In the Second World War, the Americans used the railways very heavily. 92% of their troops went to the front via railways to the ports, obviously. And in Britain, they were very heavily used at various times. First of all, the first really big use was to, first of all, do the initial British Expeditionary Force to France, and then to help the people out of who'd been evacuated from Dunkirk, getting them away from the Channel ports. Very efficient operation, where we used, rail trains from all around the country. So they were absolutely. I don't think maybe people wouldn't quite understand now, in the days of motorways and the days of aeroplanes and so on, just how essential the railways were in the war effort. And in preparing for D-Day, the railways were absolutely essential. Again, they stationed troops next to railway stations to ensure that all the troops could get to the ports on time and so on.
What is it about trains that gets you? Because, I mean, you're not a train spotter, but you've written lots of books about trains.
Well, I'm not a train spotter because I'm not really very interested in the technicalities. What my whole sort of work has become is trying to sell the idea to people of the essential nature of the railways for all sorts of things. War is obviously one of them, but my other history books have looked at, for example, the growth of London as a result of the London Underground system, or how the railways completely transformed Britain. You know, when you think about it, before we had railways, nobody travelled faster than a galloping horse. And then the railways came along.
Or indeed travelled more than a few miles outside the
generally
village
not.
or town.
No, absolutely. And people have forgotten that. For 70 years, we had railways for 70 years before we had cars. And I just want to sort of preserve that history and get people to understand that. But the technicalities, they leave me completely cold. And train spotting as well.
Me too. Bobby, trains appeal to you? Very quickly.
Well, I like going on them when they go on time, but in the Second World War, I just wondered, when they removed all the signs from train stations, any sign that actually had any effect?
Well, I think there was a lot of guff about that sort of thing because, it was to pretend that we're all in this together, as it were, familiar phrase. And actually, a lot of it was a waste of time and what people lost.
We've run out of time. That brings us to the end of our hour. Well, it's been a delight to be with you. Bobby Friedman and Christian Wolmar. Engines of War and Berko are their books. Coming up next is Duncan Barks. I'll be back tomorrow at 7. This is LBC 97.3.
If I may go through the specials of the day.